Well, g'day and welcome to the Apprenticeship Toolkit. I was going to say podcast, but it's not really a podcast. It's a series of videos. The reason I had podcast on the brains is today I'm going to talk about another podcast that I've found particularly helpful, but also entertaining from time to time. It is the Phil Vischer podcast. And I just want to do a quick hands up who's heard of Veggie Tales. You heard of Veggie? So some of you have, some of you haven't. I can see through the screen right now, and I can tell that some of you have never heard of Veggie Tales, but the majority have. Behind Veggie Tales was a man by the name of Phil Vischer. Now he's a pretty creative kind of guy, and actually I'm just going to go over here because I think I have. Yep, I have it over here. Just sorry, I'm moving out of shot. This is really wrecking the whole video thing, but I found that I was given this book for Christmas, and I read it in a couple of days. This is his autobiography. It's called Me, Myself, and Bob, and it's the story of the big dream behind Phil, the Veggie Tales, and how they wanted to take on the world and become the next Disney, and then the collapse of the whole empire and what the implications of it were. I really recommend that book. Phil is friends with an author I really respect. His name is Skye Jethani, and I'll quote him from time to time. And there's another lady who goes to the same church the two of them go to in Chicago. Her name is Christian Taylor. And for the last number of years, they've been doing a podcast that is simply called the Phil Vischer podcast. The very first episode went to the internet on the 31st of May, 2012. And since then, they've developed a bit of a format where they sort of talk through many of the current issues of the day, particularly those pertinent to the church. And it's often a little funny. As you would imagine with the creator of Veggie Tales, there's often a quirky sense of humour. Skye is more the theologian and the thinker, and will often bring a big picture kind of approach to things. And Christian Taylor grew up in the south, the southern parts of America, and brings kind of a really healthy dose of both scepticism as to what both Skye and Phil are saying, but also in some ways a nice sense of naivety to it, to sort of saying, yeah, but how does all this work? And that's kind of what she asks all the time. So yeah, but how does all that work? And she brings kind of the every person kind of thing, because sometimes Skye and Phil will be engaged in a conversation that may go over the heads of many listeners, and I think having Christian there helps ground it and brings it back to earth and helps them be able to find a way to communicate it in a way that makes sense for everybody. Now, the benefit of that is that they've actually interviewed some of the great thinkers in the Christian church over the last, since it started in 2012. Some of my heroes, like people like N.T. Wright and man by the name of John Walton, who is one of the foremost Old Testament scholars. But look, lots and lots and lots of people they've interviewed. But it's not just the interview. In fact, the format has changed a little bit over the last few months, so that the three of them get together and talk. And then Skye now, where it used to be the three of them doing the interview, now Skye is leading the interview and bringing resources and talking to people who can help shed light on particular things. So it's more it's in terms of a podcast, it gives you a bit of a grounding and helps you think through issues you might not have currently thought through before. So let's have a listen. If I play this, here we go. Now if I go at that, you'll hear this is
me, Phil. Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Skye Jethani. Hi, Phil. Hi, Skye. And Christian. Christian. We need like a tumbleweed sound. How about crickets?
We should get some more sound effects other than you.
Yeah, well, would you be willing to play them live? Because you can get them and you can put them on like your iPad, and they have buttons for different sounds, and you can be like a
okay. Well, there you go.
All we have is time.
That's kind of the intro, and then what happens? And I need to cue this up earlier, but Phil actually pulls out his ukulele and does an introductory song. Let's just see if it may come up. Let's see.
I know it's limited. There's only like emojis.
Come on, Phil.
Really
let's get this moving.
Emotions.
See if I can speed them up.
One sound effect,
but it's kind of universal.
No. Here we go.
Hey, it's a podcast.
Okay.
What do you know?
There we go.
It's a podcast. We got no video. Hey, it's a podcast. So in here. The Phil Vischer podcast starts right here. Oh, we'll talk to Sky. Hi. But Christian's gone.
Okay,
so
and
I'm just sitting here singing my theme song.
Okay, well, let's stop it there. You get the idea. He always sort of does an intro like that, and in some of for most of the first episodes, he would then at the end of the podcast try and construct a song based on the whole podcast up till that point, and that would be how the song the series or the episode would close. But for the last few months, he hasn't been at the end of the podcast, and so hasn't been doing that. But I have found it's just one of those episodes. It's light, gets you thinking, and it often provides a helpful perspective on some current issues. Look, they're American. Don't hold that against them. And a lot of what they are talking about is American politics. But these days, American politics has a pretty big impact on the rest of us. So that's helpful. I do think that the perspective I get through this is helps me think more broadly, and has introduced me to authors and thoughts that I wouldn't have had any other way. So I've been listening to this for the last 3 or 4 years, on and off, and they have a new episode that comes out weekly. Yeah, I'd recommend it. It's the Phil Vischer podcast. It's available where all good podcasts are sold. Well, they're not really sold. They're given away. By the way, there's other things you can subscribe to from them. They've got a Patreon subscriber thing and other things, but the podcast, of course, is free. I'd recommend it. If you're looking for something, if you're driving around and you're looking for something to have a listen to, sometimes the humour may be a little borderline. At the moment, Phil is got this series of news stories focused around butts. Some of it is a little bit like little boys' humour. Other times, it's really quite profound and moving. So it's one of those things that you don't listen to it necessarily as a deep theological thing, which is good. It's sometimes it's just entertaining and fun. In fact, their sub heading on the podcast says "Funny, Thinky Christianity" or Christiany. No, it says "Funny, Thinky Christiany." So it's kind of Christian. It's kind of gets you thinking, and it is kind of funny, and all of that together makes for an entertaining podcast. Recommend it, and I hope you find it as enjoyable as I have over the last few years.